Well, the answer is no. You're not saved because of your family. There's a good desire from parents to pass on their faith to their children. And so to ensure that your kids kind of pick up the baton of faith where you left off. And that can lead to sometimes just this maybe lack of recognition that a kid has to make their own decision.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Follow-Up, where we recap this week's sermon so you can grow deeper in your relationship with Jesus. I'm here with Pastor Adam and Pastor Ryan. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Carrie.
Thanks, Carrie.
Yay. We're diving into Romans chapter 11 today. One God, one gospel, one people. First question, how do we see this idea of being accepted because of our family today in the church? So the gist of that is like, am I saved because my parents believe in Jesus, or is it something different?
Well, the answer is no. You're not saved because of your family. I do think that a lot of times there's a good desire from parents to pass on their faith to their children. And even within a family, like we are this kind of family. And so to ensure that your kids kind of pick up the baton of faith where you left off. And that can lead to sometimes just this maybe lack of recognition that a kid has to make their own decision, that everybody has to make their own decision and decide whether or not they're going to follow Jesus. So it can also lead to, I work with, kids and students. It can lead to kids and students who think, well, I am a Christian because, I grew up going to church. I went through confirmation. I went through First Communion. I went through whatever it is. I was baptized when I was really little, or maybe as a baby, and to kind of think of themselves as Christian. And what they mean by that is like, well, I'm not another religion and I'm not an atheist, whereas the New Testament talks about, something individually has to happen with each person.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes, and it really counters this idea that you have something based on affinity, based on always having been around something, that it's always been a part of kind of your sphere or your history, but it's not based on any of that. It's based on personal faith.
Yeah.
How do we see that aspect of it show up in Romans 11?
Yeah, well, I think specifically, historically, what Paul's dealing with is that Jewish people at the time considered themselves to be in right standing with God by virtue of being Jewish. So, God had made covenants and promises with the nation of Israel to Abraham, to you and your descendants. I'm going to bless all, the families of the earth through you. You'll be blessed. And so people had taken those promises to mean basically like, hey, just because I'm Jewish, I'm good to go. And Paul is combating that and saying, no, actually, it requires a personal response to Jesus. It's not simply a matter of being ethnically Jewish. And actually he's doing that through Romans 9 through 11, talking about how there was this faithful remnant, that's the word he uses, and we'll talk about that more, but this faithful group within Israel who were always God's true people. And so I think he's doing that to stake out, like, he's not arguing something new that doesn't show up in the Old Testament. It's all throughout the storyline with Israel that God had this people within the covenant people of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good.
Oh.
God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Can you go into the reason as to why this is a very heavily debated topic?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Kick it off.
And as we've talked about it amongst pastors at Spring Lake, really the nature of that word. What is the essence of that word?
Yeah.
What does it mean? What is it defining? And so
the word foreknew.
The word foreknowledge. Yeah, because that gets into the whole realm of, okay, what does God do? And then what is my responsibility to that? And we like to place things in categories. And so it's almost like, okay, what's God's responsibility and what is my responsibility? And so really the two ways of understanding foreknowledge is one is God is aware ahead of time of what is going to happen because he's God and he's all knowing and he knows what's going to happen. Yeah. And he responds to that, but that man is given completely free will within that. The other aspect of God's foreknowledge is that God foreknows because he is effectively making those things happen. So not only is he aware, not only does he know, he is making sure that particular results happen. So when it comes to that, then it brings up the question, well, then if God is sovereign over all of those things, then why do I need to share Jesus? Then am I just a robot? Am I just doing what God is already known or ordained that I'm supposed to do. And then the problem of evil as well. Then is God somehow evil if he's sovereign over that as well? So it brings out a whole bunch of different issues that people wrestle through in that. And where I would say, based on our understanding, just looking through Romans 9 through 11, that it's not clearly, okay, is it this or this? Yeah. It's both. Yeah. So in other words, in God's foreknowledge, that Paul is clearly laying out in Romans 11 that those he foreknew, those that he reserved, the 7,000 with Elijah, those that he's chosen, that there's an active component that God is doing, but then also a component at the same time that we are responsible for, that we cannot just defer, that everyone is responsible for their own decision and receiving that by faith. And so that whole dynamic is what believers wrestle through, still believing it's by grace. We all believe it's by grace that we're saved, but how does that play out in the regular everyday aspect of life, and in particular with this, our salvation?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that folks who take the view that foreknowledge means that God essentially like watches the video play out, he knows exactly how all of history is going to play out. And that's what it means that he knows things in advance. I think that a lot of times they gravitate towards that view because of, God's love and his commands that he tells people to choose things, and he talks about a genuine love that he has for us, and he wants people to love him. And so there's this implication that, okay, if God commands me to choose something, then he can't have decided that I'm going to choose it. He must just know what I'm going to do. And so I think people kind of gravitate towards that idea of God kind of knows things in advance, but he doesn't determine them in advance. And I found that in my own study of just even the word, the way that knowing is used of people in the Bible. Like if you go in the Old Testament, you talk about God in Amos says that he didn't know any of the other nations, but he knew Israel. Well, it doesn't mean that he didn't know the other nations. It means he didn't have a relationship with any of the other nations. And in Jeremiah, it says he knew him before he was born. And then parallel to that, I chose you before you were born. And so I think that language of knowing in advance of people, not just of events, almost always signifies a relational kind of thing. And so I think that's why in those verses, I see it as God saying like, I thought of you as me being in a relationship to you, in advance, even before you were born. And again, that gets into mystery as to how am I responsible for my choices then if God has, selected that and he knows what I'm going to do. He's even decided some ways what I'm going to do. But we have to hold both of those things in tension and not to try. I personally am like, it's above my pay grade to know how those two things work together. I'm just going to follow the commands of Scripture and trust that God's sovereign. He's working it all out.
Right. Right. And that's where I think that's so important, that faith doesn't necessitate a full understanding. Yeah. Right. But faith is trusting even in those aspects that we can't understand, but that we hold to, okay, there is a tension here because I see God saying this and I also see this. So I'm not throwing one out for the sake of the other. I'm holding both of those things in tandem and worshiping God as he's revealed himself in that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the beauty about even Spring Lake is that we can hold differing views on how that actually works. Yeah. Right. And that's not one of the major things that all of our pastors have to believe. Yeah. So it's one of those things that we can have great debates about. Yeah. Another thing that people in the church today debate a lot about is remnant theology, dispensationalism. Can you guys talk a little bit more about both of those? Yeah, so let me start with dispensationalism because we have such a small time to do it, in the message. But dispensationalism is the idea that God made promises and covenants to national Israel, to ethnic Israel, and that those promises largely have not been fulfilled. Some of them, dispensationalists would say, were fulfilled when Israel was reconstituted as a nation in 1948, and with the giving back in the land and that sort of stuff. But a lot of folks would hold that with the coming of Jesus, they rejected the Messiah, and so kind of God's plans with Israel have been put on hold. And right now, God's focused on the Gentile church, Gentile meaning non-Jew church, and there's a way
awaiting a time where God's going to kind of resume things with his people, Israel. And so dispensationalists, when they talk about Israel being God's chosen people, they would mean that in a continuing sense today, to be ethnically Jewish means that God has, maybe political things for them in store in the future, promises from the Old Testament that he hasn't yet kept to them that he's going to keep. So you can see dispensationalists have a really keen eye to what's going on in the nation of Israel today. They oftentimes identify biblical Israel with the current modern state, secular modern state of Israel. And so there's a lot of watching for what's going on in the world that way. And so, and at its most extreme, again, it kind of tends to look like God has two people. He's got Israel, and then he's got the church. And those two are different entities. Whereas, do you want to talk about remnant theology?
No, you're doing
okay.
Really
Doing
good.
great. Okay.
You're doing really good.
Whereas I think we are framing it up as that. Paul talks about there being this remnant within Israel. So you got ethnic Israel, but then within Israel, there's this subset of people that God has preserved for himself, and those Jews that remain faithful to Yahweh. That's what it looked like in the Old Testament. They were the ones that did not bow the knee to Baal. But then Paul sees that the continuation of that group, the remnant, are those who believe in Messiah Jesus. So I was reflecting on some of this, like, this is why Jesus chooses 12 disciples. He's like reconstituting Israel and amongst his disciples, that they're like the new tribes of Israel. They're the remnant of the faithful, right? And there's all kinds, you picked up on a couple of these things in Matthew, where Jesus is talking about, God can create children for himself out of nothing. Yeah. And so there's all sorts of hints of this in the Gospels where, okay, the Jews who believe in the Messiah Jesus, that's the remnant first and foremost. And then it's like, well, what about all these like non-Jewish people that are coming to faith in Jesus? Are they Israel too? And that's where Paul's argument says, like, yes, they're grafted into the remnant of Israel. So that in certain places, and this is where I learned a lot in studying this passage, certain places, Paul can refer to the whole church, Jew and Gentile, as Israel. I think about in Galatians 6. I think he's doing that in Galatians 6. He says, to those who believe, to the church, or to the Israel of God. But here, I think in Romans 11, when he says remnant, he means Jews who believe in Jesus. We would call them Messianic Jews. And then Gentile Christians like me, I'm not Jewish, we've been grafted in to the olive branch. So what kind of was new for you in studying this, or what kind of were you picking up on as you were learning about the remnant and all that?
Yeah, I think that, just looking through those different ways, because, and I think we might have even talked a little bit about this in the Revelation series, that we've done, that, my background was more dispensational, holding that very tightly, and really through the study of God's word, and even, just further into Romans, this aspect of what does it mean to be the people of God, really the fulfillment of all the promises being in Jesus, that your standing before God is not based on ethnicity or history, but just seeing the fullness of all of that, how Jesus answers all of that, and how the hope is not for, hey, look, the Israelites are looking at rebuilding a temple, or they're looking at reinstituting a sacrificial system. As believers, that should not excite us. Because the hope for Israel is the Messiah,
That's right.
Jesus, not going back to something from the old covenant.
Yeah.
And so the reminder of this picture of how God, and here's what was so exciting for me too, just this mystery of God, and looking at that, of how when Paul refers to the mystery of God, he's talking about something that was previously unknown regarding salvation history, that God is now accomplishing, even through something that in the time is very difficult, like the hardening of the Jews, how that's expanded to Gentiles. And now through the work that he's doing in Gentiles' lives, how that impacts the Jews. And so for all the world, all the nations, these promises being fulfilled to Abraham, to David, through Jesus, for the benefit of God's people. The picture of that for me was just like really encouraging.
Yeah, majestic, very neat.
To wrap things up, I would love to know from you guys, in Romans 11, it talks about the importance of having our own testimony to share the gospel. Can you share a little bit more about why that's so important for us today?
Yeah, I think, really, as we look at, that aspect of what we talked about before, with God knowing and also man's will, that one doesn't ignore the other. Paul has already been saying in Romans 9 how he's in anguish that, his people would come to know Jesus. And yet he's aware there's a hardening that's happened. And he has this ministry to the Gentiles, but he's using it in a way he's wanting his people to be jealous, that out of what God is doing in the lives of his people, that more people will want to respond. And it's a reminder for us that we have influence. We have influence in our families, in our relationships, in our workplaces, that there should be a distinction that causes other people to look at us and say, what's different about them? They look at the state of our marriages, not that we're perfect, not that everything is great all the time, but how we handle the challenges, how we handle our failures, how we handle the heartaches, the difference that Jesus makes in our lives should cause other people to see something that's different from the rest of the pattern that the world has. And we're going to go into that even further in chapter 12.
Yeah. And I think, testimony can be so powerful because it kind of sneaks people past people's defenses in that, if I'm just saying like, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about that? And kind of poking and prodding, we can put our walls up. But if someone says to you, Jesus changed my life and I was this way and that way. And I don't know how I could get up every day without him. And he's my joy and he's where I take all my meaning from. And it's like, someone can't argue with that. It's like, wow. And just, I think God uses those stories.
Yeah. So good.
Well, thank you guys for joining us for this week's episode of The Follow-Up. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss out on an episode. And we will see you guys next week as we continue in Romans 12.